The wind carried the scent of sweat, tobacco, and old whiskey through the trading post. The place was alive with murmurs of trade, the clink of silver exchanged for pelts, and the occasional crack of laughter from men who had spent too long in the wilderness. Abigail Carter adjusted her shawl, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear as she stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by a few lanterns swaying from wooden beams, casting long, restless shadows. Her father, Jed Carter, stood near the counter, speaking in hushed tones to a man she didn't recognize. The man had a lean, wolfish face, a scar dragging from his temple to his jaw. His dark eyes flickered toward her, assessing. She had seen men like him before, drifters, outlaws, the kind her father warned her about. She approached cautiously. "Pa!" Jed startled, rubbing the back of his neck before forcing a grin. "Abby, there you are. Thought I told you to stay with the wagon." "There weren't nothing to do but wait," she said, frowning at the way his hands trembled. "What's going on?" The scarred man chuckled, flashing yellow teeth. "Ain't right to keep a lady in the dark." She stiffened at the way his gaze lingered. Jed exhaled sharply, glancing at her with something that looked an awful lot like regret. "Abby, listen to me. You trust me, don't you?" Her gut tightened. "Course I do." He looked down. Then, "Don't fight." It happened too fast to scream. A pair of rough hands seized her from behind, locking her arms to her sides. The air was knocked from her lungs as she was dragged back, boots skidding against the dirt. "Pa!" she cried, twisting, struggling. Jed wouldn't meet her eyes. She kicked wildly, catching her captor's shin. He grunted but didn't let go. "Feisty little thing," he muttered, hauling her toward the door. "Jed, you sure about this?" the scar man asked, though he already jingled a pouch of coins in his palm. Jed's silence was louder than any answer. Abby thrashed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her own father. He was letting this happen. "Please, Pa," she begged. "Please don't." She caught a flicker of something in his face before the door slammed behind her. The night air was cold, but her blood boiled. The man who held her was tall and broad, his grip unyielding as he hauled her toward the tethered horses. Another man, thinner but just as cruel-looking, was securing the saddlebags. Abby's stomach churned. She had heard of girls vanishing along the frontier, some stolen, some sold. None ever returned. A whistle sliced through the air, and a third man emerged from the shadows. The leader, Boone McGraw. Even Abby knew his name. His reputation slithered ahead of him like a rattler in the brush. A murderer, a thief, a man who built his fortune on blood. He was older than the rest, his graying beard cut sharp against his weathered face. He looked her over like a man appraising a horse. "She'll do," he said. She lunged, but the man holding her yanked her back against his chest. McGraw smirked. "Ain't no need for all that, missy. We're going to take real good care of you." Abby bit down on her captor's arm. He cursed and let go just long enough for her to stumble forward. She ran 3 steps before another set of hands caught her, twisting her wrist so hard she cried out. McGraw sighed. "You're going to learn, girl. Ain't no use fighting fate." She was thrown onto a horse, hands bound before she could claw her way free. Tears burned in her eyes as she twisted, searching for her father. Jed stood on the porch of the trading post, his shoulders hunched, his face carved from stone. He had not moved an inch. "Pa!" Her voice cracked. "Why?" He did not answer. McGraw swung onto his own horse, looking pleased with himself. "Let's ride." The night swallowed them whole. The trail was rough, every jolt of the horse sending fresh aches through Abby's body. The moon cast a pale glow over the trees, stretching their shadows long and thin like skeletal fingers. Terror sank its teeth into her. She didn't know where they were taking her, but she knew what happened to girls in places like McGraw's. The outlaw leader rode beside her, whistling a lazy tune. "You ever ride before?" he asked. Abby kept her mouth shut. He chuckled. "Ah, silent type. That'll change." The thought made her stomach turn. The night deepened, and the campfires of McGraw's hideout flickered through the trees. They rode into a clearing filled with rough men, dozens of them, their faces hardened by violence and greed. Some played cards, others sharpened knives. A few turned to watch her arrival, their grins unsettling. McGraw dismounted and dragged her from the horse, his grip tight around her arm. "Put her in the cabin," he ordered. She was shoved inside a small wooden shack. The door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place. She was alone, or so she thought. A quiet sniffle came from the darkness. She turned. A boy, no older than 10, huddled in the corner. His clothes were torn, his face smudged with dirt. Abby's heart clenched. "They'll come for you," the boy whispered. "They always do." Her breath came fast. "What's your name?" "Nathan," he muttered. "You." "Abby." Nathan curled tighter into himself. "You ain't gonna leave here." She refused to believe that. The weight of betrayal settled on her chest, crushing, suffocating. Her father had sold her. Her father. She clenched her fist so tight her nails bit into her skin. No, she would not stay here. She would not be broken. Through the cracks in the cabin wall, she saw movement beyond the firelight. A figure in the trees, watching. Not one of McGraw's men. Something in her gut whispered. Hope. And hope was something she would not let go of. The night pulsed with the sounds of the outlaw camp. Gruff voices. The occasional burst of laughter. The clatter of dice rolling across a wooden crate. Smoke curled from the fire, thick and acrid, making the air heavy inside the cabin. Abby sat with her back against a rough wooden wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. Nathan lay curled on the dirt floor beside her, his breathing shallow and unsteady. She didn't know how long she'd been locked inside, only that every second sharpened her resolve. She could still feel her father's absence like an open wound, but she had no room for grief. Grief wouldn't save her. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Abby tensed. The door creaked open. A lantern's glow flooded the room, illuminating Boone McGraw's rough, bearded face. His dark eyes scanned her like she was little more than livestock. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's a long day." She didn't answer. His mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Ain't no use in fightin' fate, girl. Best learn that sooner rather than later." The door swung shut. The lock clicked. Silence settled again, thick and suffocating. Nathan stirred, his voice barely a whisper. "They'll take you first. They always do." Abby swallowed hard, forcing herself to steady her breath. "No, they won't." The boy turned his head, eyes hollow. "You can't stop Em." "I won't have to," she murmured. Nathan frowned, confused. Then the shadows shifted. A hand covered her mouth before she could scream. The grip was firm, but not cruel. She struggled for only a moment before she saw him, the man from the trees. Tarak, a Shawnee warrior, tall and silent as the wind. His face was painted with streaks of soot, blending him into the night. He smelled of pine and damp earth, his dark eyes sharp with urgency. He held a finger to his lips, then motioned for her to follow. Abby hesitated only for a breath before nodding. Nathan clung to her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "Don't leave me," he begged. Tarak's gaze flicked to the boy, unreadable, then back to Abby. She set her jaw. "We take him." Tarak's only answer was a slight nod. He worked quickly, pulling a knife from his belt and slipping it between the wooden slat of the window, prying them loose without a sound. The night air rushed in, cool and fresh. He gestured for Abby to go first. She squeezed through, landing in the damp grass outside. Nathan followed, his breath coming in quick, frightened gasps. Tarak moved like a shadow, his bare feet silent against the ground. He pressed a hand against her back, urging her forward. They ran. The trees swallowed them in darkness. Abby's heart slammed against her ribs, but she forced herself to keep moving. She could hear the muffled hum of voices behind them, the outlaws unaware for now. Tarak led them through a narrow deer path, winding through dense underbrush. The branches clawed at her dress, her breath coming hard and fast. Nathan tripped once, and she hauled him up, whispering for him to keep going. Then, from the camp, a shout, and then another. Boots pounded against the earth. A gunshot cracked the silence. They knew. Tarak pushed them forward, his pace unrelenting. Abby's legs burned, but she refused to slow. The world blurred into motion, the glint of moonlight on leaves, the wind tearing at her hair, the distant roar of water. A river. The sound grew louder, the rush of it echoing in her bones. The trees thinned, opening into a jagged slope, leading down to the water's edge. The current was fast, twisting through rocks and fallen branches. Tarak didn't hesitate. He grabbed Abby's wrist, yanked her forward, and plunged into the icy water. The cold stole the breath from her lungs. The river wrapped around her, pulling, dragging. She kicked hard, her limbs sluggish, her dress tangling around her legs. A small cry, Nathan. She twisted, searching. The boy flailed, his head bobbing under the surface. Without thinking, she lunged toward him, gripping his arm. Tarak swam beside them, his movements controlled, powerful. He grabbed Nathan, pulling him up onto his back, then reached for Abby. "Hold on," he ordered. She barely had time to obey before the river wrenched them forward. The current battered them against rocks, spun them in circles. Water filled Abby's nose, her mouth. The cold gnawed at her bones. And then, a branch. Tarak grabbed it, straining against the current. Abby clawed for the shore, her fingers digging into the muddy bank as she hauled herself out of the water. Nathan caught beside her, choking on river water. Tarak climbed up last, breathing hard. He turned, scanning the woods, listening. Abby followed his gaze. Torches. The outlaws had reached the riverbank. McGraw's voice carried through the night, low and steady. "You ain't got nowhere to run, girl." Her breath caught. They weren't safe. Tarak motioned for them to move. They climbed, slipping on the damp earth, pushing through the underbrush. Another gunshot split the air. Bark exploded from a nearby tree. They were too close. Abby's pulse thundered. They needed cover, a place to hide, a way to disappear. Tarak grabbed her hand, yanking her to a fallen log covered in thick moss. He pushed Nathan down beside it, then pressed a finger to his lips. Silence. The torches bobbed closer. The men waded into the river, cursing. One of them scanned the trees, his rifle at the ready. Abby's fingers dug into the dirt. "Spread out," McGraw ordered. "Find them." The men fanned into the woods, their voices growing fainter. Abby barely breathed. Minutes passed, stretched thin with tension. Then nothing. Tarak touched her arm lightly. "Move." They rose, slipping deeper into the forest, their movements slow, careful. The danger hadn't passed. It wouldn't for a long time. Abby's legs trembled from exhaustion, but she kept going. She had no choice. The night stretched endlessly ahead, the shadows deep, the silence pressing. And behind them, the hunt had only just begun. The forest swallowed them in darkness, the towering trees stretching high above like silent sentinels. Abby's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed forward, her limbs aching, her dress clinging to her soaked skin. The night air bit at her, but she hardly noticed. The only thing that mattered was moving, staying ahead, surviving. Nathan stumbled beside her, his small body shivering violently. She reached for him, steadying him with a firm grip. He was cold, too cold. Tarak, silent as ever, glanced back at them, his dark eyes assessing. He motioned for them to follow, leading them deeper into the wilderness, where the outlaws' torches could no longer reach. The sound of pursuit had faded, but Abby knew better than to think they were safe. McGraw wouldn't stop hunting her. The terrain grew rougher, the ground uneven with roots and rocks that threatened to twist an ankle with every step. They moved for what felt like hours until at last, Tarak raised a hand, signaling a stop. A clearing stretched before them, moonlight glinting off a narrow stream that wove through the land like a silver ribbon. A fallen tree lay across the water, creating a natural bridge. On the other side, a small overhang of rock jutted from the hillside, offering shelter. Tarak moved first, stepping onto the log and crossing with the ease of a man who had done it 100 times before. Abby followed, gripping Nathan's hand tightly as she guided him across. The boy's legs wobbled, but he made it. The cave was shallow but dry, a welcome relief. Tarak crouched near the entrance, his gaze sharp as he listened to the distant woods. Abby sank against the wall, her body heavy with exhaustion. Nathan curled up beside her, teeth chattering. "We need a fire," she whispered. Tarak's head tilted slightly, considering. Then he reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small bundle of dried moss and flint. Within minutes, he had coaxed a flame to life, the warm glow flickering against the stone walls. Nathan inched closer, stretching his fingers toward the heat. Abby did the same, her body aching for warmth. As the firelight danced over Tarak's face, she studied him, his strong features, his quiet strength. "Why did you help us?" she asked finally. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, without looking at her, he said, "McGraw is a sickness. He takes what he wants, destroys what he doesn't." Something in his voice, low, steady, sent a shiver through her. There was more to his hatred of McGraw than he was saying. "Have you fought him before?" Tarak's jaw tightened. "Once." Abby didn't press. She wasn't sure she wanted to know the story. Instead, she turned her attention to Nathan, smoothing his damp hair from his forehead. His eyes fluttered closed, his breathing slowing as exhaustion took him. Abby let out a shaky breath. "What now?" Tarak stirred the fire absently. "We keep moving. North." "McGraw won't stop hunting me," she murmured. "I know that much." Tarak's gaze met hers, unreadable. "Then you learn to fight." The words settled in her chest like a challenge. She had never lifted a weapon in her life. Never had to. But the girl she had been before, Jed Carter's daughter, the obedient settler girl, was already gone. She thought of her father's face, of the way he had stood on that porch and let McGraw take her. The betrayal was a raw wound, but it fueled something inside her. She nodded. "Teach me." Tarak studied her, as if weighing her resolve. Then, slowly, he reached for the knife at his belt and placed it in her palm. It was lighter than she expected, the handle smooth from years of use. She curled her fingers around it, feeling its weight. Tarak leaned forward. "First lesson. The knife is not your weapon. You are." She swallowed hard, but she didn't look away. The days blurred into a brutal rhythm. They moved at dawn, covering miles before the sun reached its peak. Tarak taught her as they walked, how to step without making a sound, how to listen for movement in the brush, how to spot tracks in the earth. At night, he showed her how to fight, how to hold the knife properly, how to strike without hesitation. She learned that hesitation meant death. She failed at first, again and again. Her strikes were too slow, her footing too unsure. But she kept trying. She learned. Her hands, once soft, became calloused. Her arms, once weak, grew stronger. The girl who had been dragged from the trading post was no more. One evening, after a long day of training, Tarak threw a small pouch at her feet. She opened it to find a few roots, some dried berries. "Eat," he said. Abby scowled. "This isn't enough." Tarak raised an eyebrow. "Then hunt." She exhaled sharply, looking around the forest. She had never hunted a day in her life, but she was starving. Nathan needed food. She gripped her knife and stood. The hunt was harder than she expected. Hours passed before she finally spotted movement. A rabbit, no more than 10 yards away, its nose twitching as it foraged in the undergrowth. She crouched, steadying herself. Her grip tightened around the knife. She threw. The blade struck true. A sharp thrill shot through her as she ran to retrieve her kill. The sight of blood should have sickened her, but instead, she felt something else entirely. Control. That night, they ate well. Tarak said nothing, but there was approval in his eyes. Days turned to weeks. The leaves began to turn, the nights growing colder. McGraw's men were still out there, hunting them, but they had learned to stay hidden. Tarak led them through trails only he knew, deep into the wilderness where no outlaw would dare follow. Nathan grew stronger. He no longer flinched at every shadow. He smiled more. And Abby had changed. She no longer thought of herself as a helpless girl. One morning, as she was sharpening her knife, Tarak crouched beside her. "You're ready," he said simply. She looked at him, startled. "For what?" Tarak's gaze was steady. To stop running. She knew what he meant. McGraw was still out there. And as long as he was, she would never be free. A slow breath filled her lungs. She had spent her life being told what to do, who to be. But now she had a choice. She met Tarak's eyes and nodded. It was time to end this. The forest was silent in a way that only meant one thing. Danger lurked nearby. Abby crouched low behind a cluster of thick brush, her breath steady despite the pounding of her heart. She had once feared this moment, but now fear was just another part of her, something to control, something to wield. Across the clearing, Boone McGraw stood beside the fire, his broad frame cast in flickering shadows. His men surrounded him, their voices low. Their guns rested within easy reach. They hadn't seen her yet. They didn't know what was coming. Tarak knelt beside her, his presence steady, grounding. He had led her this far, trained her, tested her. But this was her fight. Nathan clung to the base of a tree behind them, small hands gripping the bark. He had wanted to help, but she had told him to stay put. She wouldn't let him risk his life for her revenge. Tarak leaned in, voice barely a whisper. "You don't hesitate. You strike first." Abby nodded. McGraw had taken everything from her, her home, her father, her innocence. But he had also forged something new within her, something he would never see coming. She moved, silent as a wind. She crept forward, the knife cool in her grip. The fire cracked and popped, masking the soft sound of her footsteps. McGraw's voice carried through the night. "Spread out at dawn. The girl ain't dead yet. She's out there somewhere." A murmur of agreement rippled through the camp. Abby's grip tightened. She was done running. A twig snapped beneath her boot. One of the outlaws stiffened. "You hear that?" McGraw turned, eyes narrowing. "Who's there?" For the first time, Abby didn't feel fear. She stepped into the firelight, shoulders squared, knife glinting in her hand. The men stared in disbelief. She saw it in their faces. The girl they had expected to see was gone. McGraw's lips curled into a slow, mocking grin. "Well, I'll be damned. The little settler girl thinks she's a warrior now." Abby didn't blink. "You sold me, like an animal." McGraw shrugged. "Your daddy made his choice." A flicker of something dark burned through her chest. Not pain, not sorrow, just cold certainty. "And I'm making mine." Tarak struck first. A blade flashed through the firelight, burying itself in the throat of the nearest outlaw. The man gurgled, collapsing as chaos erupted. Abby moved on instinct. She lunged, her knife sinking deep into another man's side before he could even raise his gun. Gunfire cracked. Tarak twisted, a bullet grazing his shoulder, but he didn't falter. He moved like a storm, swift, unstoppable, cutting to McGraw's men with ruthless precision. Abby ducked low as a man swung at her, the glint of steel slicing through the air where her head had been. She drove her knife up into his gut, twisting hard. He gasped, eyes wide with shock, before he crumpled. McGraw was backing away now, hand on his revolver. His men were falling. The tide had turned. Abby locked eyes with him. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." He fired. She dove, rolling across the dirt as the bullet missed her by inches. Her fingers found a discarded rifle. McGraw turned to flee. Not this time. She raised a gun. Her hands were steady. McGraw froze, his back still to her. Then, slowly, he turned, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Go on, then. You think you got the guts?" The girl he had taken from the trading post wouldn't have. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She pulled the trigger. The shot rang through the night. McGraw staggered, hand flying to his chest, eyes wide with disbelief. He collapsed to his knees, mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. Abby stepped closer, towering over him now. He tried to laugh, but all that came out was a wet, rasping sound. "Guess you ain't your father's girl after all." She knelt beside him, voice quiet. "No, I never was." He slumped forward, unmoving. The fire crackled. The night stretched into silence. And Abby breathed. It was over. Tarak stepped beside her. Blood streaked across his arm, but his expression calm. "You did what needed to be done." Abby looked down at McGraw's lifeless body. The weight in her chest was not regret. It was something else entirely. Freedom. Nathan ran toward her, eyes wide with awe. "You did it," he breathed. She pulled him close, holding him tight. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Not because she had been saved, because she had saved herself. Tarak watched her for a long moment, then nodded toward the woods. "Come, the frontier is still waiting." Abby exhaled, looking at the dark horizon. The wilderness stretched ahead, endless and unknown. A few weeks ago, she would have feared it. Now she welcomed it. She took Nathan's hand, met Tarak's steady gaze, and stepped into the night.